On the western shore of the River Foyle, where the oak groves of an early medieval saint gave way to the only complete circuit of defensive walls still standing anywhere in Ireland, the city known as Derry to some and Londonderry to others has endured under two names for 4 centuries. The walls built by London guilds between 1613 and 1619 withstood 3 sieges, including the 105 days of 1689 when starvation itself could not breach the gates, a resistance that shaped identities and divisions still felt today. This video uses artificial intelligence to reconstruct Derry's past visually. These are interpretive images generated from historical research, architectural evidence, and period descriptions. Small inconsistencies may appear, but this approach allows us to see moments otherwise lost to time. We begin with Columba's Oak Grove Monastery in the 6th century, trace the Tudor conquest and the Plantation of Ulster, witness the Great Siege that earned the title Maiden City, follow the city through partition and the Battle of the Atlantic, and arrive at the Civil Rights Movement, Bloody Sunday, and the long path towards reconciliation, from Sacred Grove to walled citadel, from siege to 2 names, from conflict to the awkward courage of peace. This is Derry. The monastery St. Columba is said to have founded on the oak-covered hill above the Foyle, traditionally dated to around 546, rose on land granted by a local Gaelic king, a place the Irish-speaking world knew as Dura, the Oak Grove. Contemporary accounts from the Columban Federation describe the location as a natural island formed where branches of the river divided and rejoined, the slopes thick with the native oaks that would give the place its enduring name. Medieval chroniclers recorded how pilgrims approaching from the water could hear the community's bells across the marshland before the timber buildings came into view through the morning river mist. The scriptorium produced manuscripts that found their way to Columban houses across Ireland and northern Britain, whilst the community itself remained under the spiritual authority of the federation that regarded Columba as founder and guide. The settlement endured even as Viking raiders penetrated this far up the Foyle, their longships navigating the tidal reaches that carried them to the river systems. The annals note several attacks between the 9th and 11th centuries, recording losses of books and church plate, yet the settlement persisted. By the medieval period, Dura had evolved into a small Gaelic town within the orbit of the O'Doherty and O'Neill lordships, its streets clustered around the hill where the monastery's successor churches stood. Visitors throughout the later Middle Ages remarked upon the oak woods that still dominated the surrounding slopes, a landscape feature so persistent that travellers' accounts continued to reference the canopy visible from the river approaches. The town remained distant from the centres of English royal power in Ireland, its daily rhythms governed by the turning of the seasons and the spiritual offices that had structured life at the site for nearly 1,000 years. The Tudor conquest brought armies northward with increasing frequency. What had been a sacred place at the western limit of Christendom's reach now occupied ground that military strategists recognised as the key to controlling access into Ulster from the sea. The monastery's oak groves had long vanished when a catastrophic violence swept through the garrison settlement in 1608. Sir Cahir O'Doherty, Irish chieftain of Inishowen, launched a devastating assault that burned much of the town and killed the English governor George Paulet. Contemporary accounts describe the settlement reduced to charred timber and stone foundations, the work of decades destroyed in a single attack. The rebellion's failure opened Ulster to a transformation more complete than any previous conquest had achieved. In 1613, a royal charter renamed the town Londonderry. The flight of the Earls, 6 years earlier, had left the Gaelic lordships of the north without leadership, and the English crown moved swiftly to fill the vacuum. The Honourable the Irish Society, backed by London's livery companies, received responsibility for constructing an entirely new, fortified settlement on the western bank of the Foyle. What followed was the systematic erasure of the Gaelic town and its replacement with Ireland's first planned city, built to a grid pattern that would later influence British colonial settlements across the Atlantic. Between 1613 and 1619, architect Peter Benson oversaw the construction of defensive walls that would prove unique in Irish history. The circuit, approximately 1 mile in circumference, rose between 12 and 35 feet in height and width, depending on the terrain. 4 main streets radiated from a central diamond to 4 gates: Bishop's Gate, Ferry Quay Gate, Ship Quay Gate and Butcher's Gate. The project cost over £10,000, financed entirely by the London guilds whose investment in Ulster would bind the city's Protestant planters to England for generations. The walls that took shape during those 6 years remain completely intact today, never breached in 3 subsequent sieges, the only such complete circuit anywhere in Ireland. In 1633, the planters completed St. Columba's Cathedral in Plantation Gothic style, its porch bearing a stone inscription that still reads, "If stones could speak, then London's praise should sound. Who built this church and city from the ground?" Archaeological evidence beneath the cathedral foundations shows the Gaelic settlement layers abruptly ending, replaced by English building patterns and material culture. The fortified Protestant town now occupied territory that had been Gaelic for 1,000 years. By the 7th of December 1688, the walls built for the London guilds had stood intact for nearly 70 years, never tested by assault. Contemporary accounts describe that morning's tension when word arrived that an army of 1,200 men, mostly Highland soldiers, in the service of King James, approached the gates from the south. The garrison governor, Robert Lundy, appeared ready to admit them. 13 young men, apprentices to the city's guilds, seized the keys and closed the gates in the faces of the advancing troops. Their names were later recorded with civic pride, among them Henry Campsie and Samuel Hunt, journeymen learning trades that would never resume their ordinary rhythm. The weeks that followed turned the walled enclosure into a sealed chamber of survival. Governor Lundy argued for capitulation and fled in April. His departure so reviled that his name became, throughout the Protestant communities of Ulster, synonymous with betrayal. King James himself appeared before the walls that same month and called for surrender. The defenders' reply entered folklore as 2 words shouted from the ramparts: "No surrender." Contemporary witnesses recorded the phrase echoing across the stone circuit, a refusal that committed the population behind the walls to whatever deprivation siege would bring. The deprivation came with methodical cruelty. Archaeological excavation of refuse pits from this period confirms what the written accounts describe: a population that consumed every edible resource within the circuit. Horseflesh disappeared first, then dogs, then rats. Leather from shoes and harnesses was boiled into something approaching sustenance. Records kept by military surgeons document the progression of starvation through the garrison and the civilian population sheltering behind the defences. Thousands died before the siege ended, their bodies interred in mass graves, whose locations later archaeology would confirm. Across the Foyle, a timber boom, a floating barricade of logs chained together, blocked relief ships from reaching the quays. For 15 weeks, this barrier held. On the 28th of July, 1689, the ship Mountjoy, under covering fire from a second vessel, drove through the boom and broke it. Contemporary accounts describe the sound of splintering timber carrying across the water to the walls, where the surviving garrison understood, before any formal word arrived, that relief had come. The walls themselves were never breached. From this fact emerged the epithet that would attach to the city through all subsequent centuries: the Maiden City, a fortress that hunger could not break nor assault could penetrate. The siege defined an identity that 300 years would not diminish. If this reconstruction of Derry's past resonates with you, consider becoming a channel member. Your support enables the visual work of rebuilding these lost moments, frame by frame. Now the city faced the long repair. The walls survived their great siege, but the decades that followed brought a quieter transformation documented in parish registers and shipping manifests preserved across 2 centuries. From the 1700s onwards, the Foyle became one of Ireland's principal emigration gateways, its quays witnessing departures that would reshape the Atlantic world. Tens of thousands embarked from Derry's wharves throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the majority Ulster Scots Presbyterians fleeing religious restrictions, rack-renting landlords and recurring harvest failures that left whole townlands empty. The shipping companies that managed this exodus left detailed archives. The McCorkle line, operating from 1778 maintained regular sailings to Philadelphia, New York and Quebec, their most celebrated vessel, the Minnehaha, earning the affectionate title of Green Yacht from Derry. Port officials recorded the pattern repeating each spring, families gathering on the quays with their bundled possessions, the smaller vessels ferrying passengers out to deeper water. During the Great Famine years of the 1840s, when the countryside emptied into the city, even as the coffin ships departed weekly for America, Derry paradoxically gained population, whilst simultaneously dispatching thousands westward across the Atlantic. Yet even as the Foyle carried away so many, those who remained built something singular. By the mid-19th century, Derry had become the world capital of shirt making, its factories employing tens of thousands in an industry that reversed the usual patterns of Victorian society. Contemporary observers consistently noted the city's distinctive character. Women formed the overwhelming majority of the workforce, their wages supporting households, whilst husbands and fathers often remained unemployed or sought work elsewhere. The factory system that emerged created a matriarchal economy unique in the British Isles, documented in census returns that showed whole streets where women held families together through their labour at the sewing machines. This culture of working women endured into the 20th century, when Amelia Earhart brought her Lockheed Vega down in a field just north of the city in 1932, completing the first solo transatlantic flight by a woman. The Derry shirt workers who met her recognised something of their own circumstances, a world where women's work had long since ceased to be unusual, where necessity had made them the foundation upon which everything else stood. The partition treaty signed in 1921 made Derry a border city separated from Donegal, the county that had served as its economic hinterland across 3 centuries of trade and migration. Contemporary maps show the new international frontier running just a few miles to the west and south, severing roads that linked the city to market towns which had supplied its factories and absorbed its exports throughout the industrial age. Ships that once carried linen and shirts down the Foyle to Glasgow and Liverpool now sailed past villages whose inhabitants could no longer cross freely into the city where many had once worked. The electoral boundaries drawn within Northern Ireland during the 1920s divided Derry's wards in patterns that placed control of the corporation in unionist hands despite the Catholic majority amongst the city's residents. This arrangement persisted across 4 decades, housing allocation and municipal employment following sectarian lines that left nationalist families concentrated in overcrowded quarters below the walls. The Bogside, a district of steep streets descending from the ancient ramparts to the marshy ground near the river, absorbed much of this pressure as families doubled and tripled within dwellings built for single households during the previous century. Unemployment in the Catholic wards ran consistently higher than in Protestant districts, a disparity that people from both communities acknowledged even as they disagreed about its causes. The shirt factories kept working, yet the weight of the city's nationalist majority found no reflection in the body that governed it. Only the Second World War briefly redrew the city's mood. Derry's position on the far western edge of Europe made it the most important escort base of the entire Battle of the Atlantic, the closest Allied harbour to the convoy routes that kept Britain alive. American and Canadian sailors filled the streets in their thousands, and a sprawling naval base spread along the Foyle. When the war ended in 1945, the defeated German U-boat fleet was brought up the river to surrender at Lishahalli, just downstream of the walls. Then the sailors left, and the city settled back into its older divisions. By the middle 1960s, visitors to the city remarked upon a peculiar calm maintained through arrangements that both communities understood could not endure indefinitely. The walls still stood complete above the Bogside, monuments to a siege remembered differently on either side of an invisible divide that ran through nearly every institution the city contained. Photographs from the period show orderly streets and busy commerce, a frontier town whose calm rested on foundations far more fragile than they appeared. The campaign for a second university in Northern Ireland ended in 1965 when the government awarded the new institution to Coleraine instead of Derry, a decision that contemporary observers recorded as deepening resentment in a city where Catholics faced documented patterns of political and employment discrimination. Political scientist John White's research showed that whilst the area held less than a quarter of Northern Ireland's population, it generated nearly 3/4 of all discrimination complaints lodged during this period. On the 5th of October 1968, a civil rights march organised by the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association met a police cordon that forcibly dispersed the demonstrators. Footage from that afternoon spread across television screens, marking what many historians identify as the spark that ignited the Troubles. The following August, after the annual Apprentice Boys Parade, the Battle of the Bogside erupted when residents fought police attempting to enter the neighbourhood. Barricades went up across several districts. Contemporary photographs show painted declarations that Free Derry had withdrawn from state authority. Then came the 30th of January 1972. A civil rights march moved through the Bogside on a Sunday afternoon. Soldiers of the Parachute Regiment opened fire on unarmed civilians. 13 people died that day. A 14th man succumbed to his wounds months later. The youngest victim was 17 years old. Hospital records and witness statements documented in the subsequent inquiries describe scenes no city should hold in its memory: bodies carried through streets, families gathering in corridors, the weight of a silence that fell across both communities when the scale of loss became clear. The decades that followed brought checkpoints and searches, grief compounding upon grief, families from both traditions bereaved by violence that respected no boundary of faith or allegiance. Several districts maintained their barricades well into the 1970s. Military patrols became part of the daily pattern documented in thousands of photographs now preserved in archives. Yet journalists including Ed Maloney later reported that Republican leaders in DRRRE had negotiated a de facto ceasefire as early as 1991. Whether the claim holds entirely true or not, violence did ease measurably in the city during the final years of conflict, earlier here than in Belfast or many other localities. On the 10th of April 1998, negotiators signed the Good Friday Agreement. The document opened a path towards peace that the city's dead would never walk, but which their children might. The Peace Bridge opened in 2011, a slender arc of steel and light spanning the Foyle between the old walled city and the waterside, its footpath crossing the river that had divided communities for generations. 2 years later, Derry became the United Kingdom's first city of culture, a designation that prompted civic rediscovery. Murals were repainted, buildings restored, the quays along the river transformed into public spaces where both traditions could gather. From 2018 onwards, the television series Derry Girls offered the world a different portrait of the Troubles years, told through adolescent eyes with warmth and irreverent humour, and audiences across continents found themselves charmed by a city they had only known through news footage of violence. The ancient walls still stand intact above the Bogside, their complete circuit the only one surviving anywhere in Ireland, walked daily by residents and visitors who pause at the same bastions where apprentices closed the gates in 1688. From St. Columba's Oak Grove to a globally beloved comedy, the city with two names, besieged 3 times, partitioned, divided, bereaved, never surrendered. It simply learned, at last, to live with both its memories.